I think I might have gotten this from Lionel Bailey's introduction, but the ego in this tradition is understood almost the opposite of how it's understood in the American inheritance of it, the very positivist, modern, imperial, capitalist, individualist, subjectivist kind of approach to ego psychology. That's the American approach. The Lacanian one, that ego is not a substantive or concrete or sort of like it's making up for a dilemma, for a series of contradictions and problems. The ego is a fissure or a scab or a wound that is sort of like a trying to cope with these breaks in existence, which is utterly, to the complete opposite of this idea that it's like this wholeness that we can get back to, which is, by the way, also there's like fascist undertones to the idea of like an authentic wholeness, like that, we've just been removed from that and now we can just excavate back to it, through the therapeutic process.
Yeah, I agree. And so here's how I would state it though. So I even though he doesn't really give him credit, Lacan was influenced by Sartre's work on the ego, the transcendence of the ego. And for Sartre and for Lacan, the ego is not something intrinsic to consciousness. It's something that consciousness builds from exteriority, from external things, right? It builds the sense of egoic consciousness out of the external world. And so for Lacan, it's my reflection in the mirror. I'm not that reflection in the mirror. And that reflection in the mirror is not intrinsic to consciousness. But what happens is that the reflection in the mirror gives consciousness a sense of wholeness, because now I'm like, before that, the baby is just this fragmented body, right? It's helpless because it has no motor control, no unified control of its body. It's just kind of, this is polymorphous, perverse, right? Where the body hasn't gained a sense of wholeness, and it hasn't been given parts through language, right? Language, or we would call it society, right? It imposes, you can't show this part of your body. This part of your body's for this. That, like, right? The body's not cut up through signifiers. It's not interpreted. And so the first thing that happens is that the uncoordinated infant who is suffering from this fragmented body, it sees itself in the mirror, it makes the identification, and it goes, oh, that's me. And through that, it gets a sense of wholeness because there's an image it can latch onto, right? And it's actually through this that it's able to start gaining control over itself. And that's the thing with the imaginary, though. It's all tied up with a sense of wholeness. So aggressivity is a fundamental aspect of this whole imaginary order, because the imaginary order is all about gaining a sense of wholeness, right? Through various images, through things you identify with. Well, say you meet somebody and they're very much like you. Well, you have this aggressive reaction to them because you feel like they're taking some part of you and you're not whole. Now you're fragmented again, you're lacking. And so aggressivity is built into the ego and built into the imaginary, because anything that is there to destabilize the ego, or, oh, now you're lacking, you're not complete, right? That's met with aggression or aggressivity. It makes it aggression for Lacan is just like what we call aggression, like violent outbursts. But aggressivity is this more structural, fundamental thing that has to do with anybody attacking your ego, or you feeling that somebody's taken your sense of identity, and yet at the same time, right, at first somebody who's very similar to you, you meet them with aggressivity because you feel like they're a threat to your identity, and yet if one of you gives, right, a lot of the times friendships are forged out of this, and it's somebody you come to love, right? Like the whole thing with love and hate, the thin line right here in when it comes to the ego. So if they are like you, they can actually come to reaffirm your existence because they've already made those identifications for themselves. So at first it seems like they're a threat to your identity, but if you come to identify with each other, you reflect each other in a way that's positive or affirmative. And so you can actually come to love this person because they're just reflecting the image of yourself that you want to have back to you.
Great. And so this, how does that tie into the idea of like fundamental fantasy? And what is the fundamental fantasy? Like if we're talking about the imaginary, the real, and the symbolic, what is a fundamental fantasy in relation to those three things?
Okay. Well, I'm glad you went there because I definitely wanted to talk about fantasy tonight. So this is great. So let me see. I'm not looking at YouTube right now. On the board, you might want to put up the formula for fundamental fantasy. Okay, you remember it's the Bard S, the Bard subject, and then the little diamond-shaped lozenge, and then the little lowercase a.
Like that?
Let me see. There's a lag here. Hold on.
Yeah. So money sign, diamond, little a. Do I need more room? Should I erase the imaginary, symbolic, and real?
Hold on. On the video, you're just now getting to the board.
No, that's fine. But should I erase the stuff in the middle of the board, or?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You can take the three orders off now.
Okay. So I just built this shelf, but it's not nailed down yet because I'm going to paint it tomorrow. So I wanted to explain that for the people who might have noticed how markers keep falling off of it because it keeps sliding out and they fall through. Anyway.
Okay, so what we're going to do, we're going to touch briefly on the Bard. There's three components to this, right? For LACAN, this is fundamental fantasy, or the formula for fundamental fantasy. Now, this gets trickier when we start talking about the clinical structures, which I know you want me to go into that so much, but we'll have to do it another time because, again, I'm not really prepared to go in depth with the clinical structures. But for LACAN, he talks about these various clinical structures, and you have neurosis, and then under neurosis, you have obsessional neurosis and hysteria. You also have perversion, and you also have psychosis, right? So the hysteric and the obsessive and the pervert, they all have different structures to their fundamental fantasies. However, the one that's up on the board right now, Bard S, diamond-shaped A, that also is the obsessive's fundamental fantasy. And LACAN thinks that the obsessive fundamental fantasy, at the most abstract, broad, structural level, is the fantasy, is the formula for fundamental fantasy as such, right? It gets at the bare bones of it. But when you get into the meat, the details of the differences between obsessive, hysteric, and pervert, you're going to find three different formulas for fundamental fantasy. And so maybe at some point in the future we'll come back and get into that material.
And so, you know, I get that you're not going to go into it further. And like I said last time, folks, and if you don't remember this, getting a Lacanian to talk about anything Lacan related in any detail is very difficult. If you ever want to have fun and you hear someone drop in Lacanian jargon, just start asking them what they're talking about and keep pushing in, because beyond Michael Downs, I've never found a person who really can without getting outside of the jargon, because they're so in it they can't get outside of it, and it's because they haven't spent enough time outside of grad school talking to, you know, normal people anyway, or because they're too afraid of fellow academics trying to take them down. It's like academia for people who are in really niche fields, especially in the humanities, can often just be like a hotbed of cancel culture, but it's like a weird kind of cancel culture where it's like in academic journals and people trying to be like, your take on Objet Petit was bullshit and here's why, and it's like 500 pages of trying to take you down, but you know, the whole time probably mischaracterizing you from the offset just because they're trying to publish for the sake of publishing, because there's a lot of that going on as well. So Anyway, that's my dunk on academia. But the thing I'll say about those clinical structures that we can't get into obsessive, hysteric, perverse, and the psychotic is just that when you have talked about that, that's what you have already said has been given me a lot of traction already with things, to the point that I would say it was probably these plus the mirror stage and just like maybe 3 other things that we talked about last time that over time have grown to me being like, yeah, no, I have to read Lacan. I have to read a lot of Lacan. I never really would have thought that. I for years wouldn't have thought that. When it comes to theory, I was just no, not going to mess with it. But now I'm like, yeah, well, these are really useful. But as far as the theory of subjectivity, though, this idea of a fundamental fantasy. So if the obsessive is kind of like a sort of default from which the other ones are going to be sort of, they vary from it in important ways, right?
No, here's the thing. So this is, and a lot of this, right, I'm still working out. That's why even
Okay.
I'm, like, I need to really refine my understanding of the clinical structures before I can do a lecture on them. But
Okay.
for Lacan, from what I've read, hysteria is actually the primary form of neurosis, and obsession or obsessive neurosis is the modification of that structure. So it's bizarre that the obsessive fundamental fantasy is primary. Again, I don't know how they sort all of this out. I trust me, if I ever got a chance to talk to a Lacanian, this would be one of the main topics I want to work on with them, because it's hard to find. The closest we have to a systematic layout of the clinical structures is Bruce Fink's book, A Clinical Introduction to Lacanian Psychoanalysis. Lacan, or Zizek, does a lot of great stuff with them, but the thing is, he'll say something about the pervert on one page, and then 10 pages later he'll say something about the hysteric. He doesn't just lay out these clinical structures in detail. So what I've been doing is doing word searches in PDFs, and I'm putting together as many of these quotes as I can into one file, so I can see, like, I'm trying to get the broad scope of these clinical structures, and I'm basically doing the groundwork for a lecture on them, but it's just not ready yet.
Okay, fair.
And so the point is, though, we can even leave aside that. I just wanted to say that in passing, but all of us basically have a fundamental fantasy, and what the fundamental fantasy, Zizek talks about this again in Plague of Fantasies, and it's his best treatment of fantasy is the first chapter, and he talks about the 7 veils of fantasy. So fantasy covers over 7 different things, right? Or it serves as a screen, a buffer, misdirection for various things, right? And here I'm only going to touch on the first 4. The other ones get more into the details of it, and you can kind of lose track of what you want to get at the core of what fundamental fantasy does. And so here's the thing. Before we do this, I want to say a couple things about the Bard S, and then we'll talk about the little diamond shape, and then we'll do a quick review of Objet Petit A, and then we'll go into fantasy, because it helps to know what each of those little symbols means before we go into it. So I found a good little quote from Sean Homer, and I think this is one of the best summaries or summary definitions of the Lacanian subject, right? So Sean Homer says, the Lacanian subject is, therefore, constituted through 2 movements. The first corresponds to the process of alienation through language, the second to the separation of desire. Lacan never, however, precisely designates the point at which the subject appears, because it never appears as such. The subject in Lacanian psychoanalysis has no permanence or persistence. Lacan always refers to the subject as arriving or having just arrived, as always too early or too late. There is never a point in time that the subject can be said to finally emerge as a stable and complete entity. It emerges only fleetingly through a continuous process of subjectification, alienation, and separation, rather than at a specific moment in time. Okay, So here's the thing. It goes back to what I was saying earlier, right? Where the subject, the Lacanian subject, the subject of desire, the subject of the unconscious, all of these being the same thing, right? It manifests itself through formations of the unconscious, through these linguistic nodal point, right? Slips of the tongue, a symptom, right? Somebody goes into psychoanalysis because they have a symptom. Well, the symptom is a message from the unconscious. It's a once the symptom is decoded and interpreted, the idea is that the symptom will then dissolve itself. It's not that you'll ever be symptomless, but that particular symptom as a message will dissolve because the message of it from the unconscious will have been made conscious. And so the point is that with the Lacanian subject, it's not like it's a person behind the person. It's all right. It's not like we can go to say to the like conscious egoic sense of self, hey, step aside, I want to talk to the other person in you, right? It's not like the analyst can say, all right, I've talked to the ego enough, move aside, now I want to talk for an extended period with the subject. It doesn't work like that at all. The subject is only its manifestations through these formations. It's not, you can't sit there and talk with the unconscious subject like you do with the ego. And I mean, of course, there's a sense in which it's always there because you never know when a slip of the tongue or a manifestation of the unconscious is going to occur, but it's not there in the way that you as a egoic person can sit there and constantly keep talking about yourself. And so this idea of it's always just arriving or having just arrived or it just left, right? It manifests itself through some form of speech or communication and then it's gone. And these other aspects of the unconscious, like fundamental fantasy, it's part of the unconscious, right? A lot of the times you don't have any awareness of any of this, right? And yet it determines your whole subjectivity. And it's similar to like dark matter, right? Astrophysicists will posit dark matter because you have to posit it to make sense of certain things going on in reality, but you don't perceive the dark matter as such. That's what's going on with the unconscious or the unconscious subject, right? It's a hypothesis that makes sense of all this stuff you see in the clinic, but it's not there present like in this permanent way where you can just talk to the unconscious. It doesn't work that way. So the point though is this unconscious subject emerges through what Lacan calls castration or symbolic castration, or in other words, when some external authority steps in and puts limits on your enjoyment, now it's as if you've been castrated, right? You've lost something and some part of you has been castrated. Now, it's not a physical organ, it's not a part of your physical body, but when language is brought into play, when you have to obey the laws of language and then you have to accept the prohibition that you can't just enjoy yourself however you want, whenever you want, right? All of this works together as, all of the mechanisms for socialization, and yet it means something has to be sacrificed. Now, the trick is that you never really gave up anything. There's not an actual physical object or a physical part of your body you gave up. If anything, it's just a kind of like almost just a pure freedom of enjoyment. But the thing is, babies don't live in a constant, eternal bliss. They're always fussing. Sometimes they're happy, sometimes they're not, right? They don't have this pure, concentrated enjoyment or jouissance that we take them to have. But once you enter language, and once now my behavior has to be mediated through certain customs, through certain protocols, it's as if we lost an immediate enjoyment that we never really had to begin with. But this is what accepting the prohibition involves. This is what happens with socialization is it's as if you lost some core aspect of your being, and that is that sense of the remainder, that missing chunk of yourself. That's what he's going to call objet petit a, the little a that you see on the board. And so the Bard S is the subject of desire. Well, to desire means to lack something. That's why you desire. If you didn't lack the thing, you wouldn't desire the thing. And so the Bard subject is the part of you that's desiring, the part of you that's lacking, and moving towards that which will complete you. But again, this isn't the wholeness of the imaginary, right? This is all going on in the real, in the unconscious level. Even though signifiers and language are part of it, right? This kind of structure is not one. It's not like you're dealing with images that you identify with here. And so you are this relation to the lost object. You are the relation. It's not that you're just purely the Bard subject. You are the Bard subject in relation to the missing part of yourself that you posit at the unconscious level. And it's the very fact that you are this relation that is, in a sense, the Lacanian subject, right? Bruce Fink's famous book on Lacan, the Lacanian subject. You look at the subtitle, it is, between language and jouissance. So the Lacanian subject is between language and jouissance, or enjoyment. So objet petit a, that little part of yourself that you unconsciously posit that you are missing, it's like a concentrated little chunk of jouissance, of intense enjoyment. And that's what you posit to have been lost in taking on language. And so it's that thing that's always behind language. Like you're searching through language all the time. You're searching through various aspects of society. You're trying to find this thing, and yet you can't find it because it's not a thing that you actually can find. It's not a physical object. And yet this is who you are. This is what you are. Is you're the relation of your lack to the object that you're lacking. And so that's the Bard subject, the negative subject, right? And so that's the Lacanian subject. What happens, though, is we're missing this thing. We have this sense like, oh, I have desire, and I come to possess certain things, but nothing does it for me, right? There's always something unsatisfactory about the object of desire. Once you get it, it's not as great as you thought it was going to be because it didn't do to you what you were unconsciously hoping it would do, right? You're still lacking. And so what fundamental fantasy does is it creates a relationship to objet petit a. Like this is, okay, if like that's what fundamental fantasy does, is it tells you what you have to be or what kind of scenario there has to be for you to regain this lost object. And so that brings us up to where I want to talk about the little diamond shape, right? Because the diamond shape is a condensation. It's 4 signs in one. On the one hand, you have the greater than sign, you have the lesser than sign, you have the disjunction sign, and you have the conjunction sign. And so these 4 signs...
Wait, are the conjunction and the... Wait, what are those other 2 ones? I know greater and lesser, but what's the... Is it like a little? Is it kind of like a little pyramid and then an upside down pyramid? Is that kind of what is out there?
Yeah, let me see because I have a note here. The disjunction sign is the little V. It's the bottom.
Oh yeah, because it's either or in logic. Is the yeah okay.
So conjunction is the top one.
That's conjunction.
Yes. And so what you have is there's within these 4 different signs, right? Okay, I want to form a union with objet petit a, or I want to disregard objet petit a, and somehow it's like letting it go, disregarding it, that you feel like you're going to get it. The greater than is, oh, I have to occupy a higher position in society in order to get the objet petit a, or oh, I have to be very humble and I have to live a certain kind of humble existence to get it, right? All of these 4 signs are different existential attitudes we take up that we think if I'm this way, if I have this relation, this dynamic, I'm going to get it. And So those are various ways that we think like, oh, if I relate myself to it in this way, I will get it.
Genius.
And
Fucking
so,
genius. Okay, but what did you say? Okay, so you just explained how those are the 4 different shapes. But what did you call the diamond again?
It's called a lozenge. LOZENGE.
I don't mean the symbol. I mean, what did you say this? You characterize this as something. The conjunction of these 4 things is what?
Okay, well, it's a condensation, right? Because
condensation. Okay.
You're taking 4 signs and making them into one.
Okay.
We interrupt this conversation for a quick message from our sponsors.
You may recognize this conversation from the past because it is actually a piece of a longer live stream. So what I've done is I've edited the conversations I had with Mikey down into smaller chunks, and I will be releasing those serially until the launch of the Slavoj Žižek's For They Know Not What They Do course, taught by Michael Downs and myself. I will be asking him the questions and hystericizing him, along with a cohort of people who will be joining us live and in the forums as we do a close reading of what Slavoj Žižek claims is his most important theoretical work, more important than Sublime Objective Ideology by far. He said that if you don't have anything to say about For They Know Not What They Do, then keep silent when it comes to Sublime Objective Ideology. But we don't just do close, thorough, hardcore readings. We also have some more introductory stuff. And so if you go to theory-underground.com/events, then you'll be able to see the dates of all of the upcoming events. You see that the Idea of University, taught by myself, Brian, and a couple of educators who are very close to me. And we wanted to focus on Karl Jasper's short work, The Idea of University, as a way to start the year, but it's also a way for Theory Underground to get off on the right track. January 25th is the Professional Managerial Class Consciousness course that I'm co-teaching with Elton LK of the Working Class Intelligentsia podcast. And then in February, on the 25th of February, launches Žižek's For They Know Not What They Do. Mikey has spent 2 decades getting himself to the point where he feels confident enough to teach this book. And I think that humility and effort that he's put in is something that we can all learn from. I mean, come on. He's like our own homegrown Žižek. He's like our own national treasure. I think that we really ought to uplift him and give credit where it's due, not just take him for granted and act like, we don't need to. So that's a part of the reason actually why I really appreciate Brian Becker from Singularity and Sublimity podcast. He's done a lot of amazing teaching work himself. A lot of people read the blog and then don't give credit where it's due. And that would be fine if he had a cushy academic career with tenure and all that. But he doesn't. He's working in a warehouse, supporting his mom. We need to hashtag free Mikey from wage labor so that he can spend more time doing what his passion is, which is teaching philosophy and theory, writing books. That's what we want. More of these kinds of conversations. Make it possible. Make a donation. 5, 15, 20, 50, 100. Make the donation today. Please. It means a lot. Words are cheap. Money, that's where it matters. Get your skin in the game. Show Mikey you care. I hope that we'll get to do a lot more of this in the near future. And then the last thing, I'm doing a countrywide tour this year. I will be on the East Coast, I will be on the West Coast, and I will be everywhere in between. So if you want me to come to your town or city, email me. It's down below. If you want to volunteer, be a part of the street team, host or guide while we're there, let me know. I hope to be in a city near you sometime this year, and I hope that you'll take one of my classes. Thanks.